Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to first extend my thanks to every one of you who made here so early this morning to join our forum. Well, I'm very happy to introduce a very special person, Dr. Jean-Pierre Lehmann, as a guest speaker this morning. Well, what makes him so special to us is that he is the first European speaker to give a lecture on European issues. We have had so many speakers this year, I guess probably more than 10, but he is truly the first European speaker we have. And he's going to give us a talk today on the political and economic prospects of the European Union in a time of a global paradigm shift caused by current economic crisis as well as transition in the U.S. governance system. And of course, he will talk about the prospect of Korea and European Union relationship. Well, I don't think I need to spend much time telling you who Dr. Jean-Pierre Lehmann is, because his name is already quite familiar with us. Currently, he is a professor of international political economy at IMD. I think all of you know about IMD. Its full name is International Institute for Management and Development, a kind of leading business school at the moment in the world, located in Lausanne, Switzerland. But his name is better known to us as the founding director of the so-called Avian Group. The Avian Group is kind of international coalition of businessmen, government, and opinion leaders all around the world committed to fostering the open global market economy in a multilateral framework. Well, he founded it in 1995, and he's still keeping the directorship there. And before he joined IMD in 1997, he actually went through a number of universities. To name a few of them, he worked with Stockholm School of Economics in Sweden, and also he was with INSEAD, another world-leading business school in France. And he also worked with the University of Stirling in Scotland. And while working with these institutions, he has done a number of research works on East Asian economies, especially in area of political economy. Well, I learned that when he was working with the University of Stirling, he even taught East Asian history. It was a little bit a surprise to me and really nice. And as you know, the European Union has been an important partner of Korea during the post-war period, politically as well as economically. Recently, the bilateral trade volume between European Union and Korea surpassed that of between Korea and the US. Last year, the trade volume between Korea and US occupied around 12% of Korea's total trade, while that that between Korea and US was only 10%. And as you know, as the Korea-EU FTA takes place and it takes its effect sometime hopefully next year, the relationship will become more and more important and growing rapidly, I guess. So at this time of the juncture, it is very fortunate to have Dr. Jean-Pierre Lehmann here with us. And now I think it's time for me to present him to you. Thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor, great privilege, great pleasure for me to be with you this morning. I first came to Korea in 1967. So it's been a very long time, and it's been a long relationship. And every time I come back, I remember the Korea that I knew that long time ago. And I am a great admirer of the Korean achievement. And I speak often about Korea. As you've said, Professor Nam, the relations between Europe and Korea are perhaps rather distant. There's no strong historical record, and there's probably on the European side not very much knowledge or understanding of Korea. The Koreans have a friend in Europe, and as I say, I hope to continue this relationship. Among the places that I taught, I also taught as a visiting person at Yonsei University on a number of occasions. I came here a lot during the 1980s. I was in Korea virtually every month at that time. So, as I say, it's a great privilege to have been able to witness the development in this country. I only regret I don't speak Korean. I'm sorry about that. I tried. But I've come here often, but I've never lived here. And I think that would have made the difference. I'm also, I'm a European. I live in Switzerland, but my passport is French. And I've been living in Switzerland now for 13 years, but I'm really based there. I spend about 30% of my time in Switzerland and the rest of the time traveling. But I'm also quite European. My father is French, my mother is Spanish, my last name is German, and I got my doctorate from a British university, Oxford. So I think that's a sort of good European chemistry. And I lived in Sweden for a little while, and so on. Now, I was asked by Professor Nam if I had any connection to the European government or European Commission, and the answer is no. The Evian Group does do projects for the European Union. I was in India shortly before coming to Korea, where we were completing a project, but otherwise we are totally independent. And I have been, in fact, probably, if you ask European officials, they would describe me as a nuisance because I tend to be really rather critical of European policy and of the direction that the EU has taken. At the same time, emotionally, I'm very committed to the European Union. The perspective I'm going to give you this morning is, I have to warn you, sort of relatively negative. I mean, that's why I said I'm not an official. I'm not concerned with sort of giving you a sunny view of Europe, because at this moment, I think there's quite a few clouds. To put it in a nutshell, I have a sense that in spite of its achievements, Europe is in a state of drift. I will probably say this later on, but just that my own views are shared by a number of Europeans, and including some former officials. The former president of the European Union, Jacques Delors, who's now been retired for a number of years and is usually reasonably quiet, but last year did express the view that they feared that Europe might unravel. These are very, very strong words. At the time of the crisis, there was much disappointment with the lack of a European response. There were European responses. So there's a UK response, there was a German response, there was a French response, there was an Italian response, and so on and so forth. But we were sort of like all of a sudden chickens running around in a coop. There was no unified European approach to the crisis management and crisis settlement. And there's somebody else who is quite prominent as a former European, not EU, but German foreign minister, Joschka Fischer, who did a interview with the BBC on a program called Hard Talk, as some of you may know, and where he accused the European Union's plans of being, as he put it, half-baked. Okay, have you heard nothing so far? No, it's okay. So, as I say, my views are as you'll see, relatively critical, but they're not necessarily that exceptional. Now, what I propose to do is just to go back a little bit on the sort of origins of Europe, past, and then move on to the present, and then some prognostics. And first thing I do want to insist, when I say I'm very emotionally committed to Europe, I mean, I describe myself not at all as a Eurosceptic. I'm a Europhile. I'm quite a strong European, and I tend to identify myself as European with a French passport. And this has something to do, of course, with chronology, with history. I mean, if looking at it objectively, if you look at the history of the last, say, century, then I think you can say that, and I want to emphasize that the European project, European Union, is without doubt one of the greatest achievements of governance and prosperity that history has ever witnessed. That is my starting point. So when I say I'm critical of the situation at present. But on the achievement overall, I want to stress, because, you know, when we live in an age like now, at the beginning of the 21st century, we take for granted where we are, not remembering how some of the historical origins were very critical. I was born in 1945. I was actually not born in Europe. I was born in Washington, D.C., in the United States, because my parents or my mother had been a refugee from Europe. My mother was first a refugee from Spain during the Spanish Civil War, moved to Paris, met my father, they got married, and then they were refugees. So this was a little bit typical of the European story. And I just give you some sort of historical data that my grandfather was in World War I, my father was in World War II, and therefore when I was born, if you extrapolate, you would say that I'm a veteran of World War III, that my son is fighting in World War IV, and my grandsons are preparing for World War V. And when you have these, so we had a break point. I mean, Europe was, for most of the 20th century, or most of the first half of the 20th century, a battlefield. So, I think that it's, in fact, somebody in reference to ASEAN who had said we must transform Southeast Asia from a battlefield to a marketplace. And this has been achieved. Well, the same thing with Europe. We were a battlefield. I just give you some data. In the first half of the 20th century, so 1900, 1950, although it was mainly 1914 to 1945, 70 million Europeans died directly as a result of warfare. Okay, these were people who were killed by war, not people who died of a disease. Then you have many more disease associated with war, because we had the First World War, we had wars in the Balkans, we had the Spanish Civil War, we had war in Russia, we had the Second World War, etc., the war in Greece, etc., etc., etc. So 70 million. In the second half of the 20th century, from 1950 till the end of the century, until now, that number of 70 million dropped to 1 million. And none in the European Union. The 1 million who died was mainly in the Balkans, in the wars in Yugoslavia, and in the former Soviet Union. So this is really one of the aspects that has changed absolutely dramatically. The second aspect that has changed dramatically, and that is a tremendous achievement, is of course the prosperity of Europe. In the course of the period from 1945 till today, European standards of living have risen beyond belief. And of course, what's also perhaps the great achievement is that Europe in the first half of the 20th century was not only a battlefield for war, it was a battlefield of extremist ideas. You know, it's from Europe that came fascism, Nazism, communism, nationalism, and so on. And we had vestiges after 1945. So although in 1945 the Germans were defeated, Nazism was defeated, and Germany was incorporated into Europe, we still had a fascist fringe in Spain, Portugal, and Greece, which lasted until the mid-1970s, until Franco died in Spain. And we had, of course, a communist fringe in Central and Eastern Europe, which lasted until 1991 or thereabouts. It's astonishing to think, when you look back at this history of extremism, that today Europe is blessed with being a huge democratic space. The democracies are perhaps not perfect, but nevertheless, very honestly, when Franco, I told you I'm half Spanish, when Franco died in 1975, my views on the future of Spain were very negative. I wouldn't have believed that it would have transformed so quickly and so smoothly into a democracy. Even then, if I'd been told, don't worry, one day Lithuania will be part of the European Union, it would have been absolutely unthinkable. In fact, I was in Tallinn, in Estonia recently, and so walking around and saying, this is truly, truly, truly amazing that we have seen this transformation. So I wanted to emphasize these points because I think that there is, Europe has achieved an enormous amount. I think that if you look at the first half of the 20th century and perhaps the 19th century, that what Europe did to the world was on balance pretty negative and destructive. That if you look at the second half of the 20th century and now what it has done to the world is on balance probably reasonably positive. I think there's a lot of issues, but still Europe has not been a source of global conflict as it was in the past. So this is the achievement, the context, and if you like, the reason that I feel so strongly European, because I was born in 1945. My son, I have 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, so my daughters and my son, my eldest daughter was born in 69, then a son in 71, and a daughter in 72. They don't feel the same thing. This is, when I talk to them about this past, it's like, I don't know, probably when people here talk about the Korean War to teenagers. Although it may be more present because of North Korea. But, it's sort of, what's this? Well, yeah, it's got something to do with me, but the point I'm making, and to my grandsons, I have one who's 4 and one who's 3, so they don't think about these things very much yet. But I don't think it will have any meaning at all. So this is one hint, if you like, is that Europe was not an economic project. It wasn't a political project. It was above all a human project in many respects. It was based on a vision. In fact, if I want to look at what consultants would call the key success factors of Europe, I would identify saying, why did Europe achieve what it did? And I would identify the following forces. I would say one, vision. There's no doubt at all that you look at people like Monet, like Schumann, but also many others. They had a dream, they had a vision, and they wanted to communicate it. That Europe should no longer be the battlefield, that it should live up to the principles of the Enlightenment. It had a lot of idealism. That was based on, if you like, reconciliation. It had a spirit. It sought to generate a spirit of Europe, but at the same time was very pragmatic. I think that this is one of the things, because one of my suggestions at the end is that while Europe is, in my view, adrift, there's a lot to learn from Europe in terms of regional institution building and confidence building. And I think that today when we think of Europe, we tend to think of the great architects and the great ideas. But probably the most important first step was the coal and steel community. This was, so one has this great idea. How are we going to achieve it? Well, the first thing is if you lock in this coal and steel community industries, which are so vital to as infrastructure and also, of course, to defense and so on and so forth, then this can be a first step. My father worked for a French, Franco-German chemical company in potassium. He did quite a lot of business in Korea, but this was a long time ago. And again, this was my father. In fact, had been a prisoner of war during World War II. There was no particular reason why he should love the Germans, but they nevertheless together this company had both German and French. So these were very pragmatic kinds of things, not just the talk that one has found in Europe. Also incrementalism. You went step by step by step by step by step by step, pragmatically, rather than trying to sort of leapfrog, and of course bringing people along with you as you did so. There was fantastic leadership, and I think the most important is the relationship between de Gaulle and Adenauer, this Franco-German reconciliation. And this is something that I've always insisted in Japan, is to say that there is no alternative to profound reconciliation, and this has to be driven by the leadership. And that was, again, de Gaulle as a war hero, could have been an obstacle to this reconciliation, but he was a very, very important element in it. Of course, these conditions created economic dynamism and growth. The 30 years after World War II in French are referred to as the 30 Glorieuses, in other words, the 30 glorious years it was quite intoxicating. Everything that was happening was very exciting, new firms, foreign investment coming in, etc. A lot of innovation was coming at every level. There was innovation in the research sense of the term, but also in institution building and so on. There was unity in Europe. It was a unity, remember, we were first 6, the 6 original members. Then we increased to 9, then we increased to 12, then we increased to 15, and now we're 27 member states. And there was a young population. think it's also very important to remember there was a young population that brought a tremendous amount of vivacity to the prosperity and so on and so forth. So that was the construction of Europe. But now is where I turn negative and say, what's happening in Europe today? If you take these various themes, there's no vision. There's no appeal to the next generation. And this, I think, is going to, there's no spirit. There's no idealism. There's defensiveness. When we expanded and brought in these 10 member countries from Central and Eastern Europe, thank you. When we brought in these 10, some people, like myself, were euphoric, thinking, this is the realization of a dream. But as you may have seen, the reaction of many Europeans was, oh, now we're going to be invaded by Polish plumbers. There was a sense, how do we keep these people out, rather than how do we embrace them? The paradox is that in the rich countries of Western Europe, it's extremely difficult to get a plumber. And I have said that, if I could get a plumber, I'm prepared to learn Polish. But this was the sort of immediate sense, is, let's defend. It's very selfish. Let's defend what we have rather than build. Instead of the spirit, we have, I think most young Europeans in my children's age would, if you say to them, what are the words that you associate with Europe, they would say bureaucratism. Brussels, isolationism, bureaucratism. The pragmatism's gone. There's, and the example I give is there's two Lisbon connections in relation to Europe. One is the Lisbon Treaty, which I'll come back to. The other one is the Lisbon Agenda. And the Lisbon Agenda was a meeting of the Council Ministers that occurred in 2000, and that said that by 2010, Europe would be the world's most shining and biggest economy based on knowledge industries, da-da-da-da. I mean, if you read the thing, it's a folly of grandeur. When we got to the halfway point in 2005 and nothing had been achieved, Martin Wolf, the well-known Financial Times economics commentator, said the only thing that the Lisbon Agenda proves is that Europe has a sense of humor. Because, these were so wild, and it's sort of wild ideas, and then, people say, yes, well, who's going to implement it? Oh, well, sorry, I've got an appointment, I've got to go, and so on and so forth. So, then it's been revised several times and toned down, but it's fairly incrementalism. As I said, in the construction phase, you had incrementalism, and you brought people about with you. What we've had since then is top-down imposition. I don't know if you followed, the European Union decided we needed a constitution. But it didn't talk to the people. It never tried to sell the idea. It said, you will have a constitution. It was imposed from above. So there was 2 countries in which there was a referendum, and that strongly rejected it. It was France and the Netherlands, the 2 of the original countries of the 6 members. And it was rejected in the Netherlands by 63-64%. And in France, it was rejected, I can't remember, but it was also quite strong. And it was just, I think, it wasn't so much that people were against or for the Constitution. They were against this. You will have no, I mean, why? Explain, what about the citizens of Europe? What about the sense of democracy? So this has been created, if you like, tension, which didn't exist before. Leadership. I mentioned de Gaulle and Adenauer. Does anybody in this room know the name of our newly appointed president of Europe? We have one now. Isn't this wonderful? Does anybody know his name? I know the name because I've got it here in front of me, but I don't really know how to pronounce it. Van Rompuy. Van Rompuy. So, this is pathetic. I'll be pleased to talk more about it during questions and answers, but like the Economist said, you had this original idea started 8 years ago. So 8 years and you build a mountain and you produce a mouse. There's a whole bunch of questions about Europe. So there's no leadership. Reconciliation. I said the building of the Franco-German relationship was vital. What we saw during the crisis was that there was a lot of intra-EU protectionism. A lot of intra-EU protectionism, and it was quite nasty. So, for example, there was an attack in the UK on an Italian company had got a project in some gas industrial development, and they brought in Italian engineers and Italian workers, and there were huge demonstrations from British trade unions and workers saying British jobs for British workers. This is totally contrary to the principles of the freedom of movement within the European Union. My president, Nicolas Sarkozy, gave a speech saying that French cars produced in the Czech Republic, like Renault, should not be sold in France. I mean, all of these things. So this is what we had when the crunch came, the crisis came, then everybody was running off to defend his or her nationalist interests. Instead of economic dynamism and growth, the EU, it's still a very powerful economy, and I'll come to that shortly, but it's become a bit of an economic laggard. Innovation, one of the things that we suffer from in Europe very much is a brain drain. About 70% of Europeans who do their PhDs in the United States in science do not return to Europe. Conditions are much better. I have a nephew of mine who had never been able to achieve very much in France. It's a very restricted system, doesn't give much liberty. He moved to the United States. He's now vice president of Dell, covering Europe, North Africa, I don't know where else, etc. We have a brain drain and an entrepreneur drain. If you're a budding entrepreneur and you're looking for venture capital and risk, we're risk averse. So this is where the big contrast to the United States. So, if somebody comes and says, I want to be an entrepreneur, what should I do? And then the answer is, the first thing is go to California or go to Massachusetts or whatever. So we've become very risk adverse. Unity we don't have. We have a funny, it must be difficult for Koreans to figure out, but don't worry, Europeans can't figure it out either. Is that, why do we have Eurozone, non-Eurozone? In other words, that Europe is coming up much more as a patchwork than as a sense of unity. And of course, we have no longer a young population. I know that Korea is also facing this challenge, but in Europe, it's quite terrible, particularly when you get to be in that age bracket, is that there's so many people like you around. And I've told my wife that if we retire, I want to retire in a university town, like Montpellier or Cordoba, because then you have young people who are there and brings a little bit more life. But otherwise, Europe is going to be a very depressing geriatric ward as the population ages. So this is a rather, as I said, critical view of Europe, but it's, I think, a realistic one. I think it's going to cause the new post-Lisbon Treaty arrangements are going to cause confusion. And I just gave the example. For example, we would now have basically three presidents. So we have the president of the European Union, resulting from the Lisbon Treaty. We have the president, who's this Mr. Rompuy. We have the president of the Commission, Mr. Barroso. And there's a rotating presidency. So the presidency now is Sweden. Every 6 months it changes. Next one it's Belgium. So for 6 months we'll have two Belgian presidents of Europe and one Portuguese, Barroso. So I don't know whether President Lee is thinking, of this G20, which of the European presidents will come to the summit in Seoul in November? And the answer I'm prepared to bet is all three. So this will be very complicated. Then you say, but which one is the head of the EU? And the answer is that the head of the EU is probably the heads of France and Germany. Yeah, it was a very clever ploy. We could talk in the question time, if you like, a bit about the UK, but the UK has really been very marginalized now. A series of mistakes. So basically it's back to France and Germany, and then a few other minor countries like Poland or Spain, Netherlands, that play a role. But fundamentally this whole thing is now back to being Franco-German orchestration. Then the question is, but will the three presidents be speaking with one voice? No idea. So, there's a Euro confusion that's coming in at the governance level. And again, as I say, if Koreans or Singaporeans or whoever have difficulty understanding that, don't worry. We don't understand it either. But what we do know is that it's creating lots of jobs for the boys. Now, I sort of move from there to saying, well, let's give a descriptive rather than analytical picture of Europe. What is the weight of Europe in 2009? And I have some data here which I'll go through slowly because it's I think quite revealing. The population of the world currently is about 6.8 billion. The population of the EU is 0.5 billion, in other words, 500 million. So Western Europe is about 7% of the world's population. So European Union. If you take all of Europe, you add Russia and Ukraine and so on, it comes to about 11%. At the beginning of the last century, in 1900, the share of proportion of Europeans to total population was 25%. Yeah, it's 25%. So it's gone down in relative and in absolute numbers. Asia has stayed about the same, 60%, although there's realignments within Asia. A big increase this century will be Africa. But Europe's population is about 11%, and by 2050 will be about 6%. That's all of Europe. That's not just the European Union. So population is quite strongly declining. So currently 7%. If you take the number of countries in the world, according to this data that I have, there are 193 countries, 27 of which are in the EU. So 14% of the countries of the world are members of the European Union. If you take GDP on a purchasing power parity basis, the world GDP is in dollars 70 trillion, and the EU GDP is 15. So the European Union is still an important economic actor with 22% of global GDP. If you take research and development expenditure, global expenditure, the world is 1.05 trillion. EU is 270 billion. So the EU share is 25% of global R&D spending. So it's still quite high. If you look at exports, total world exports are 16.6 trillion. EU exports are 6.6 trillion. So EU has 40% of world exports, although I have to say this includes intra-EU. Okay. And then in foreign direct investment, the world is $1.86 trillion of foreign direct investment. EU is 0.84 trillion, so it's 45%. So the EU is still a major destination for investment. In fact, the figure that's cited often is that, with the growth of China and the US and China and the relationship, that total US investment in Ireland is greater than US investment in China. Now that's the current situation. Obviously the trends will be different. I don't think anybody's going to invest in Ireland now. Unfortunately, we have a few little problems in Europe right now. You probably will hear more sort of Dubai-type stories. People talk about the problems that Europe has of what they call the PIGS, P-I-I-G-S. And P-I-I-G-S is Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain. And that these 5 countries, which are all in the Eurozone, are in serious difficulty in terms of being of potential defaults on their debts. So, nevertheless, as I say, Europe is a very heavy actor, and as the point was made, it is a very important trading partner to Korea and should remain so. And what are some of the key EU challenges? Well, one challenge is not to unravel. As I say, not to anything. Nothing is irreversible. So you went from 6 to 9 to 12 to 15 to 27 countries, members of the EU. In principle, Croatia will be joining soon. That's 28. Then there's a few other question marks in Bosnia and Albania, and of course in Turkey, and I'll come to Turkey shortly. But this doesn't, you could have a reverse process beginning. Again, I think the UK is a big question mark. It's almost certain that Gordon Brown will lose the next elections. David Cameron, the head of the Conservative Party, has committed to holding a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty. Yeah, he may not do so, but the question of the UK and Europe remains open. Then we have, again, something that we share perhaps with Korea. I don't know how the Korean situation has developed, but we have a big challenge in agriculture. It's a very small part of the European GDP, but it's one of the major costs of the European Union budget. We don't have enough money for schools, we don't have enough money for hospitals for aged people, but we have enough money to protect and to subsidize the beetroot and sugar and so on and so forth. So the common agricultural policy remains a problem and of course an impediment. We have a big challenge in terms of climate change. I think Europe is probably quite advanced compared to the United States. I think the big risk for Korea is green protectionism. And you see people like Sarkozy. So that's what I mean. I think Europe is probably a little bit more advanced and more sophisticated than the United States in terms of climate change policy. But it may be used, if you like, as, many years ago people spoke about Fortress Europe. Well, there may be a new Fortress Europe coming up that is going to be protected by green walls and green fences. So that's a change. We have a challenge in terms of trade. The current Commission, I must say, is quite good. Europe has been able to maintain a pretty open trade policy by European standards. But the protectionist forces are very strong, very, very strong. And again, not surprisingly, mainly coming from France, but also coming from Italy, Spain. There's a sort of north-south dichotomy in European trade. So the north is free trade, the south is much more protectionist, and so that's where the balance lies. There's issues of security, and both in domestic or European sense and in the global sense. There's still people who would like to think of Europe as a geopolitical power. If you see, for example, the reaction to Obama's request for troops to Afghanistan, whether this is justified or not, nevertheless, has been very muted, has not been particularly enthusiastic. Then, while Europe, the 27 member countries live in a quite ideal situation, we have neighborhood issues, the Balkans. There may be another. Bosnia is a very, very small place. The population is about 3 million, but it may flare up again. There are dangers, there are signs. So there are issues with the Balkans. There's issues with the former members of the Soviet Union and the so-called CIS countries, that are European and will want to knock at the European door. What do we do about Azerbaijan? What do we do about Georgia? The president of Georgia, by the way, who's a rather funny guy, always has sort of the flag of the European Union behind his desk. I mean, he's not a member of it, but that's the aspiration. We have Ukraine is going to be a big challenge for Europe, and I think there's probably quite strong resistance. There's the whole Turkish question, and I'm very much in favor of the membership of Turkey, full member of the European Union, in due course. I mean, it has to satisfy the criteria. And what we've been doing, which is deplorable, absolutely deplorable, is changing the goalposts. So, we negotiated with Turkey conditions of entry, and then we are changing these conditions all the time. And of course, there's, this is something we can also speak about, is that among the tensions in Europe is a growing tension between Europe, which is a geography, it's a space, and Islam, which is a religion, and not a space. But we have now a fairly reasonable proportion of the population. 6-7% of the population of Europe is Muslim. In France, it's higher than that. In principle, this should be no problem at all, but the problem is being created. And of course, it's Switzerland which had this ridiculous referendum on the minarets. Switzerland is not part of the European Union, but now there are countries in the European Union that are wanting to copy that and say, so, things like a lot of discussions about whether Muslim women should wear the veil or not wear the veil, So this is an issue. And it's, of course, linked to another big issue that we have, is immigration. A lot of the problems of Europe could be solved by having much more open labor markets and encouraging immigration rather than discouraging immigration, or at least temporary immigration. But this is not the mood in Europe at present. So we have a situation where we need immigrants, but we don't allow them. So the result is that we have a lot of illegal immigrants. My mother is still alive at the age of 99, and she has a woman who looks after her, who's from Bolivia. And I discovered the other day that she's totally illegal. She came into France, but has no papers, and her visa is set. And then, so she works for my mother, she's paid by my mother, and she's lodged by my mother. She has a small flat. And when I found this out, I told my sister, who lives in Paris, where my mother lives, I said, is our mother going to finish her life in jail? But it's just an illustration of the ridiculousness. The point my sister made to me is that there's no option. I mean, if you want to have somebody to look after an old person in Europe today, you will almost certainly have to go for somebody who is illegal, who doesn't have papers, and the government sort of keeps a closed eye on that. So they know it's happening, but at the same time they don't want to change. We have a big problem. These demographic data that I gave you could change enormously if we allowed immigrants to come in. One of the reasons that I am so much in favor of Turkey joining the European Union is because it's a young country. You walk into Istanbul and you've just come from, I don't know, Paris or wherever, Milan. It's just all this bustling, fantastic dynamism of youth that would, bring a lot to the European Union. So we have problems with Russia. We don't know exactly how to sort out that relationship, and vice versa. I think Russia's got problems. Then we've got the problem of the southern Mediterranean. It's quite striking, the contrast between the south and the north of the Mediterranean. And I'll just give you an illustration. It's about 2 or 3 years ago. I was in Marrakesh, in Morocco, in June. And then from Marrakesh, I drove around into the countryside of Morocco. In Morocco, like in many developing countries, when you go to the countryside, it's full of people, goats, camel, bustling and activity and so on and so forth. And in September, I was in southern Spain, in Andalusia, and I was driving around the countryside, and the topography is very similar. I mean, these countries are very, and the architecture is very similar also, because, the Moroccans used to run that part of Andalusia, comes from Al-Andalus, which is Arabic, who ruled that part of the world for many centuries. But the big difference was that you go into Spanish villages, there's nobody. And if you see people, they're probably immigrant workers who are come to pick the olives or pick the vine. Spain has one of the lowest population fertility rates in the world. Morocco has one of the highest. I'll just give you another indicator. In 2000, the population of Spain was 3 million more than Morocco. By 2025, the population of Morocco will be 10 million more than Spain. So we have this whole Arabic area of Mediterranean, which has, I think, the world's highest demographic growth rate. So if not the highest, the second highest. 60% of the population of the Arab League is less than 25. And it's on the whole poor. And it's on the whole not many prospects for a job. So the pressures, I was told that in Tunisia, where I was recently, that according to secret polls, 70% of the top priority of young Tunisians is to emigrate. And what they want to do is to go to Italy. And of course, Italy is another country which is becoming very old. So we could benefit from these kinds of relationships, but this is a big issue now, a big challenge, a big political time bomb. We also have issues of identity now. This has partly got to do with this anti-Islam. I think part of the reaction for this, somebody wrote an interesting article the other day saying that part of the European reaction to this is that the Muslims have a sense of identity and we don't, so we're angry with them for having an identity, which we don't. But nevertheless, there is this critical issue of identity. We have the issue of aging, how we're going to approach that, and of adapting to a new world. Now, this is, I think, a reasonably realistic perspective. As I said, it's critical, and I think that, as you prepare for having perhaps more extensive relationships with the EU, that you should be aware that the EU is, as I said, in a sense of drift, a sense of sort of a little bit of decomposition. It doesn't smell particularly good. Now, in terms of opportunities, however, obviously, it's still a very big market. It will decline over time for demographic and other reasons. But I would say it's probably still a good market for another 10 years, and the FTA should be able to provide access to. I think that Korean firms can have some opportunities in Europe and the European consumption base. But and here's the management school professor speaking, you've got to adapt your cultures and your strategies. Not many Europeans want to work for Korean firms. Samsung may be an exception, because the image is not there. And Korean firms have the reputation, justified or otherwise, of being quite nationalistic, that it's difficult for so, I think Europe is a great opportunity, but you have to Europeanize to a certain extent. The Japanese never really succeeded in doing that. The Americans did. At one point it was said that the most European firm was IBM. So there are some lessons to learn, and the Europeans, there's also quite a lot, particularly as Korea is looking to multinationalize, which I guess Korea will have to do for a whole variety of different reasons. There are lessons to draw from Europe, from European firms. A European company like Unilever, for example, I think has a lot to offer in terms of, not a single of the key people of Unilever is Dutch anymore. They've really evolved, they've multinationalized quite successfully. I think there's also, when I was in Korea in September, I heard quite a lot about the, what's it called, the new Korean Green Deal, New Green Deal, or something like that. The Korean green policy seems to be quite advanced. And I think here I'm personally absolutely convinced that a green business is going to be a minefield. And that's why I'm convinced that business could be a very important part of the solution to the climate change thing. And there probably you will find in Europe more advanced or very advanced R&D in these particular areas. Many European companies, I can think of power companies like ABB, for example, they've been working solidly at these for 20 years or more. It's not just a new fashion. So I think opportunities between universities and businesses and government institutions for cooperation in green technologies. I think another area which could be interesting is collaboration in third markets, in Africa, for example. The Chinese now are omnipresent in Africa. I was in Africa a few weeks ago, and every time you turn, there's a Chinese company, and there's big hopes and so on and so forth. But I'm not sure that the way that they're approaching Africa in the long term will succeed. I think one needs more sort of subtle approaches. Now, Europeans are a little bit loath to go to Africa, but I think there may be some interesting lessons there. And then I just add, I've been coming to, I come to Asia 5 times, 6 times, 7 times a year. And then I've lived here off and on. I'm a member of all sorts of Asia-based think tanks or Track 2 organizations like CSCAP, for example, which I was at one point European delegate to. So, I'm aware and I get the publications from institutes like the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore and so on and so forth. And so I'm aware of a lot of the debates that are going on here in regard to institution building in regionally. What is the dream of having Asia, whether it's a free trade area or the East Asia community or whatever it's called. And there I really think that there's a lot to learn from Europe. This is not to say you take the European model and put it in Asia. That's not going to work. But just look at some of the steps. And one of the points that I kept making over and over again, particularly to Japan, and I still do it all the time, is to say that you cannot create economic partnership if you don't have trust. And this is one of the lessons which one has to learn from Europe. Europe was not made overnight. There's a quite famous place, I don't know if any of you have been there, in Sussex. Well, quite famous, actually it's not that famous, but quite interesting place called Wilton Park. And Wilton Park is a manor house that goes back to, I forget, very far, 16th century, 17th century. And it was owned by a family of aristocrats. And the last one died without any children. And he was a great idealist, and he was a Brit, of course, but a great admirer of German culture, of Goethe, of German music, and so on. And so when he died, he left the manor and quite an endowment to the UK government to have a center for Anglo-German reconciliation and dialogue. And this is without fanfare, no media, no photo opportunities, whatever. They're just that 10 times a year, 12 times a year, a German team would come and meet with a British team, different teams, people from government, from universities, from business, from churches, whatever, to discuss how to renew trust, how to build a relationship. And this lasted about 20 years. And then after 20 years, they thought, well, the Anglo-German relationship, purely bilateral now, is we have to look at broader. So then they started looking at Europe, and now it's a global meeting place, and it's a very, very attractive meeting place. But there's also, I run this Evian group. What I didn't know is that when I established the Evian group, there's another Evian group which has been set up by the family that owns Danone, the yogurt people, on Franco-German reconciliation. And they still meet once a year. And again, the point is, no BBC, no CNN, you meet there, very low key, but therefore you try and make it as open as possible. So this is just one aspect of it. But I think that finding, for example, when people talk about a currency, that's here. There's a lot of steps. Those are my remarks.
Okay.
Useful and too much frank presentation of the European Union current and in the past. I think we have little time left, and you are probably hoping for to have many questions to exchange. So I will not speak. I will spend too much time, and I'll just directly go to Q&A session. And one thing I want to mention is that you want to keep your question at most less than 2 minutes, so that we can squeeze juice out of more juice from Dr. Jean-Pierre Lehmann. Well, okay, Dr. Kim first.
Thank you, Dr. Lehmann. I have two questions. When you run business, there's always a trade-off between the desire to get large scale of power, etc. At the same time, you give up certain things in terms of effective, cohesive practice of management. When you see Europe, EU, I see that it was a very well-knit, cohesive unit with Euro 6. There was a vision, there was a purpose, and there was effectiveness you can execute. As you became now 27, as you said, well, pardon my excuse, the expression, it's more like a ragtag. Ragtag. It's a very difficult to organization to make decisions and move forward, etc. To what extent you think the reason why Europe became so big was in part driven by the competitive idea of overdoing US or its core NAFTA? That's the first question. Second, it relates to that as Europe became kind of ineffective largeness, what is the value of Europe, which does not represent is not really backed up by a powerful geopolitical entity like US dollar or even Japanese yen, which is backed up by the full base and credit of a credible economy.
Thank you very much. I think there are two issues which European policymakers faced. One is enlargement, and the other one is deepening. Okay? And what Europe has tried to do is to combine both. Now, the enlargement issue, I think that when you say that it was based on a desire to compete with the US, this was true of some European thinkers and policymakers, but not all. I mean, it was true, for example, of, let's say, the former French president Giscard d'Estaing, who wrote the Constitution. But I think many other Europeans just knew that Europe, whatever form it took, would never really be able to compete with the United States as a global power. I don't think, for example, that in hard power, military power, that Europe would ever have the means or the will to compete with the United States. So far as the enlargement process is concerned, it's very interesting. You know, nobody was expecting the fall of the Berlin Wall. Nobody was expecting that all of a sudden you would have all of these countries. And so I think what happened after 1991 and 1989, fall of the Berlin Wall, 1991, the end of the Soviet Union, was reactive rather than proactive. And one immediate step was to try to secure the emancipation of these countries, the liberation of these countries. So the first step was to get them to join NATO, and the second step was to get them to join the EU. And that, I guess, is partly the problem, as I indicated, that the process really didn't gain a tremendous amount of popular support. But it's very difficult. What do you do now, for example, if we can't stop? You can't say to Croatia, "Oh no, you can't get in." I mean, and this is the geographic, the boundaries of Europe have not really been defined yet. So this is going to be an ongoing issue over the course of the next couple of decades. And it may, as you may be implying, lead to, it's very difficult to manage 27 countries. It's going to be much more difficult to manage 35.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry?
Question of the euro.
The euro. No, I think the euro, the idea was to offer an alternative currency to the United States dollar. I think that euro as a foreign exchange reserve is stronger than the yen, for example. But it does have its, of course, inherent weaknesses. As I said, there's the fragmentation of Europe. So the Eurozone is not contingent with the European Union. So I think that's going to be a limitation over time. But it'll be very interesting to see. I mean, I don't know where the dollar is going. Yeah, we've spoken about Europe. We could have a discussion on the United States and the outlook for the American economy and for the American geopolitical position, and it might not be terribly encouraging. Now, I would not advise anybody here to go off and buy lots of euros for the short or the long run. I mentioned the fact. I said there is concern now. The unemployment is one thing. A country like Spain, which had been going, Spain was almost a European tiger, in inverted commas. It really grew fantastically for the first 15 years or so after it joined Europe in 1986. The Spanish economy is doing terribly, very, very high rate of unemployment. But as I said, there's this issue of the peaks, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain.
Yes.
All of them. So there's no doubt that there's a great deal of fragility in this.
Well, thank you very much for your very informative and insightful presentation. Basically, I have two questions. Number one, you said that the head of the European Union, actually, the head of either France or Germany, and in that respect, UK has been left out, and I believe that UK has been rather a passive observer during the integration process. So in this context, I think when UK is likely to join the Eurozone, and you believe that the UK will maintain the pound as a key currency because London still plays an international financial role. So, I would like to ask when it is likely for the pound to join the Eurozone. And second question, you're also expert on East Asian affairs. After the Asian financial crisis, we have been also talking about East Asian identity. And in this regard, I think this China and Japan sort of sitting on the driver's seat. But you mentioned that the trust is so important. In your view, China and Japan likely to work out the reconciliation like the way the France and Germany played in the process. And if this is not likely, what is the role of the Korea can do in the East Asian integration process? Thank you.
Thank you for the easy questions. Look, let me firstly say that the UK has always had a, now this technology is my technology.
Okay.
Okay? The UK has always had a problem with Europe. Okay? This is not new. And to a certain extent, vice versa.
Yeah.
And this comes about for historical reasons, splendid isolation, the special relationship with the United States, and so on. I must say that the one piece of good news for me in Europe was that Tony Blair was not chosen to be the president. That would have been absolutely appalling. Because, Tony Blair was a lot of talk. And he talked the European talk, but he didn't do anything European. And Gordon Brown has been much more sort of distant. And as I said, since it's about 99% certain that the Tories will get back in next year, David Cameron has been, and his foreign, the person who will be his foreign secretary, William Hague, who's a former student of mine, but I'm not responsible at all for his views, have taken a very, very anti-EU stance. So on that, I would say, when will the pound join the euro? When the UK will euro join the euro? I say probably, when you'll start see pigs flying. I don't see this. I don't see this happening. And this is linked also to a second, is that this global economic crisis, which 2008, the country in Europe, so I mentioned that we have these weak countries, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, but the country that has taken the worst battering in terms of its reputation and image is the UK. The UK model was very closely aligned with the US model. And in fact, somebody was saying at the conference yesterday, the global economic crisis initially was really a North Atlantic financial crisis. It was the US and the UK that had this financial crisis over borrowing, over lending, and so forth. During this sort of period of what Greenspan mentioned was irrational exuberance, France and Germany were seen to be really rather staid, rather undynamic. But of course, they fared much better. So UK has lost face, and it's lost reputation. And my British friends tell me they don't really see the UK recovering from this, so that they see it becoming sort of increasingly irrelevant. There'll be exodus from the city. Again, surprising things happen. But right now, I would say that the UK is really headed for decline and marginalization from Europe. So that was the first easy question. The second much easier question. You know, I mean, on this subject, I've written a lot. In fact, again, another book that came out this year called Japan's Open Future, and I've been saying very much the same thing: is that you cannot. The Japanese have to come to terms with history. Now, it's difficult for anybody to come to terms with history. You know, in, for example, my country, in France, we had the German occupation, and we had a number of Jews in France who were exterminated. Now, the myth was that they were all exterminated by the Germans. And it was only President Chirac, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, who admitted that there were a lot of French who were also responsible for this. It hurts, and I think it's the only thing Chirac ever did that was, took a little bit of effort. But so it's not to say that coming to terms with history is easy, but it's absolutely requirement. I mean, there would be no Europe if Germany had behaved like Japan. Just none. There was a lot of, as I say, for example, when I was 18, say, or 17, 18, 19, and I would meet with Germans, and I met often with Germans, there's a lot of discussions, a lot of, going back and, what happened and so on and so forth. So I honestly think, and I'm not saying this because I'm in Korea, I say it in Japan, Japan is a problem. It didn't work, it didn't help with Koizumi, and it didn't help with Aso. And I'm not sure about Hatoyama. Let's see. But, the senior minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, in his autobiography, again stresses this fact that Japan has really not sort of come to terms and was hidden from doing so. So that is really, absolutely necessary. Now, what can Korea do? The problem between also, I must admit, the China-Japan relationship is that, of course, China is a dictatorship. It also has its historical problems that it doesn't want to admit. An advantage that the Franco-German relationship no doubt had was that both France and Germany were democracies by the time they were building this relationship. So, Korea could be conceivably a venue, an interlocutor. The third party that had suffered, of course, from Japanese occupation and from the war, but that has, I guess maybe there's less of a chip on the Korean shoulder, partly because Korea is, a successful society. Economically, you're more at ease with yourselves than, say, China. So Korea could be the venue for trying to create an East Asian entente, which has to happen. Because if it doesn't happen, then I think that the risks of some conflict in this region are very, very strong.
My name is Chun Kim. I have different angles Christians, Islamic Christians. In southern part of the France, more than half of the population is Islamics. And in British, already influenced by Islamics very much. And it will be a big change in Germany, etc. And now Turkey is going to come to EU, etc. And you mentioned the Morocco also, And have you, in 2050s, around the 2050s, maybe you must consider head of the state will become an Islamic. So how can you control from that things?
I think one of the difficulties about the Islamic issue is that Europe is probably maybe the only region in the world, I don't know, that is fundamentally agnostic and secular. Christianity is very weak in Europe today. Very weak. This has been one of the big changes of my lifetime. When I was young, Whether in France or Spain, you would see a lot of priests and a lot of nuns. You don't see them anymore. You go to church in Europe, and the average age is about 70. Young people don't go. So we become, and this is truer in some European countries than others, but most countries have become very secular. Even Ireland now, for example, the power of the Catholic Church has diminished. In Poland, it's still relatively strong. In Spain, it's nothing, you see. So I think what the problem is not so much Christianity versus Islam, it's rather secularism versus religion of any form. Now, and I will be honest with you that this is also my own position. I mean, from my view is that religion is something that's very private, and that there should be very strict separation between church and state, as in fact in France we have had now for over 100 years. So when we tell the girls going to French high schools, you can't wear the burqa, we're not telling them you can't be Islamic. We're saying to you, if you come to school with a big cross, or if you're a Jew and you come with, none of these are allowed. In state schools, you can go to private schools. So we have Christian schools, Jewish schools, Muslim schools. It's okay, but state schools, no. So I think the issue is to some extent a different, when I say we don't have an identity, we don't. But if we do have one, then it's probably more of a secular identity. Now, I think, honestly, that the issue of the Islamic threat, or whatever you want to call it, to Europe is very much exaggerated by the media and by populist politicians. I live in Switzerland, but I have a flat in Paris. Most of my, very much in an Arab district, and it makes no difference. In fact, probably, the Parisians have the reputation for being very rude. And I was in a shop one day, and all of the shops around me are run by Arabs. And I was in a shop one day with my son, and I was having to buy very quickly a suitcase. And the Arab shopkeeper said to me, "No, don't take that one. That one's too expensive. Take this one. It's much cheaper quality, etc." So very pleasant. And then when I left, I'd said to my son, what we should do is kick out all the French from Paris and let the Arabs come in, and it'll be a much better place. So, there is a problem. This is not to deny that it's not a problem, but it's with the fringe. I think many Muslims adapt to the sort of secular institutions and so on, particularly in the so-called middle class. The problem we have is the so-called ghettos. There we have a problem of people who've come in, who've never been assimilated, who didn't find proper employment, didn't get proper education, don't speak French properly, but don't speak Arabic properly either, and that's a big problem. But that's a social problem more than a religious problem. And I have no difficulty at all in having a Muslim president in Europe, or indeed in France. I think I would be very happy to see Sarkozy leave, and I'm sure a Muslim president would be just as good, if not better, than he would be. So I don't think that I think in time we will have to live with this, but it's not something that keeps me awake at night.
What are the most famous think tanks of EU?
Okay, that's a problem. I mean, I could say the Evian Group, obviously, but that is a problem. That is a problem we don't really have. There's a few. There's, for example, maybe the most dynamic now. The two most dynamic is the what's it called? The European Reform Center. It's run by a very good friend of mine. I can't remember his name. He's a former economist journalist. That's one. Another one is called the Lisbon Council. So European Reform Center is based in the UK. Then there's this Lisbon Council, which is run by a German woman called Anne Mettler, which is in Brussels. and probably still the Chatham House in London, although it's British, but it's Europeanized, and the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, and I would guess maybe also the Center for European Policy Studies, CEPS, in Brussels, and the Evian Group.
Okay, I think time has run out already. It's over 9 o'clock, so we'll have to release him from this morning's duty and go his another work to do. And I think we'll wrap it here, this morning session. And keep in mind that we're going to have next January meeting on January 21st. So keep it in your record. Arlen Sinai is coming from the U.S. and he's the world's most expert in forecasting, and he's going to deliver the worldwide picture forecasting next year. And it's time of turmoil, so his projection will be very valuable to many of us. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. And thank you very much for Dr. Jean-Pierre Lehmann. And by the way, his name Lehmann has nothing to do with the Lehman Brothers. That's what I confirmed this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.